and welcome to episode 6 of Cold Case Christmas 2025. In this case, we're going to the south of England and the brutal slaying of an elderly couple in their own home. Over 50 years later, this case is no further forward than when they started. This is the senseless slaying of Warren and Elizabeth Wheeler. "83-year-old Warren Wheeler had spent the best part of his life, in fact 27 years, as a stoker in the Royal Navy. When he came out of the Navy, he had various jobs, including that of a postman. At the time of his murder, he lived with his 79-year-old wife, Elizabeth, in a house called Yatscombe Cottage in Boars Hill, Oxfordshire, which is a village just a few miles south of the famous university town of Oxford. So there's Oxford, there's Boars Hill. In 1973, when this crime occurred, everyone in Boars Hill knew everyone else. It was a very close-knit community. The couple had lived in their cottage for nearly 30 years. They were getting on in years, and so was the cottage. It had fallen somewhat into rack and ruin, and it had no running water or electricity. Yet Warren and Elizabeth muddled on. Warren was a well-known figure in the local community. He was a creature of habit, and this is why when he wasn't seen, and the newspapers and the milk that they had delivered to their door weren't collected, well, that's when red flags were raised. On October 9th, 1973, the Wheelers' neighbour, Lily Berry, became concerned that she hadn't seen either Warren or Elizabeth, and the milk delivery and newspapers were outside the front door, and they normally brought them in straight away. So she called the cops for a welfare check, and when they arrived, they found a brutal scene. One cop who led the investigation from Oxford Central Police Station, someone called Detective Chief Superintendent Cyril Jones, said it was a savage, brutal, and the worst he'd ever experienced in almost 30 years as a police officer. His theory was that someone had broken in to rob the place, but it was like rack and ruin, so how many valuables did they really think there was? But during the investigation, cops found £300, which is almost £4,000 in today's money, in the cottage. Detective Chief Superintendent Cyril Jones said that, well, maybe they were disturbed and the killer left without picking up the money. We don't know the motive, and to this day, the crime is unsolved. So the cops started to work backwards. When did this actually occur? And when were the couple last seen? Again, Warren was a creature of habit. He was last seen on the morning of Monday, October 8th, 1973, walking towards the Fox pub. He often stopped there for a morning drink. They do believe that was the last sighting of either Elizabeth or Warren, and then it was the following afternoon, about 2:30, when the cops got into the cottage and discovered this brutal, senseless slaying. So the hunt was on. They knew the killing had occurred any time from the morning of October the 8th into October 9th. So the hunt was on for a killer. Obviously, those in the local community were completely shook to the core. Nothing like this had ever happened in this quiet little sleepy village. So there was at least 100 police officers involved in the hunt for Warren and Elizabeth Wheeler's killer. Initially, a roadblock was set up around the couple's cottage, and they stopped every driver in hope that someone would remember seeing the killer, who would have had to have been bloodstained unless they took a change of clothes. It would have been obvious if someone had left that scene on foot. They were scared that the killer might strike again, so they warned all householders in the vicinity to not open your door, to double check people's credentials, don't let people in. But then again, they didn't know whether this killer was someone the Wheelers knew. If it was someone they knew, then there wouldn't be any question. They would have just let them in. Anyhow, within a week of the murders, there were a number of persons of interest. They sought to track down the couple's foster son, who was 37 years old. I assume that they did get him and he had an alibi because he was ruled out. There was a few strangers. Now remember, this is a very small community. Everybody knows everybody else, so strangers stand out. A couple of strangers were highlighted to the cops. The first was seen near the cottage around 7 p.m. on the Sunday, described by locals as being 25 to 30 years of age and appeared to be waiting for a bus. Okay, nothing wrong in that. That could have been someone passing through and possibly completely gone out of the area by the time the murders occurred. The second man was spotted by workers who were repairing gas pipes late on Tuesday morning. He was said to be looking frightened and walking quickly towards the village of Sunningwell, so walking out of Boars Hill. Okay, interesting. Other witnesses saw a man, this was a promising lead for cops, on the day of the killing, walking towards Oxford, so walking north from Boars Hill. He was said to be ruddy-faced and having rough, long, dark hair with scratches down the side of his face. So that, obviously, was very concerning to the cops. Cyril Jones said he wanted to hear from anyone who may have stopped to give this man a lift. But all of these leads came to absolutely nothing. Police employed tracker dogs in the hunt for the murder weapon. The Wheelers had been brutally beaten. They didn't know what the weapon was, but they knew a weapon had been used. Brutally beaten. Finding the murder weapon might have fingerprints on it. 1973, it was the days before DNA testing was a thing. Getting the murder weapon was something that the cops really wanted. They began the painstaking process of taking fingerprints from thousands of men in the area. Not just Boars Hill, but Abingdon, Woolton, Sunningwell, and all the villages surrounding Boars Hill. They got metal detectors out and nothing. DCS Jones said, "I believe there could be a mother or a wife somewhere who may be holding information back about the identity of the killer. Someone has lived with this brutal murder on his conscience for 5 weeks now. It could be that someone returned home heavily bloodstained or in a shocked condition, and that their relatives know this." And then, 3 months later, in January of 1974, a chef called Kenneth Narn called a police station in Manchester, which is near my neck of the woods, so well over 100 miles away from Oxford. Just called the cops in Manchester and confessed to the murders. You know, the news had gone nationwide, and Kenneth wanted to confess. He was brought down south, brought in front of a judge, and charged with double murder. The cops thought they'd solved it, that Kenneth Narn, aged 33 at the time, but the guilt had got to him and he just had to confess. So the case went forward, opening the case against Narn at Oxford Crown Court in July of 1974. Prosecutor Douglas Draycott said the attack was so ferocious that a piece of wood used to batter the couple had split into 3 pieces. In a moment of panic or desperation, what was intended as stealing was turned into one of the most brutal murders that had ever occurred. One of the witnesses, Ronald Murray, he said he saw Kenneth Narn at the Fox pub on the Saturday evening, just 2 days before the murders. He told me he hadn't got much money on that night, but would have plenty of money on Monday. Edith Cooper, another witness who saw him at the Barton Community Centre bingo session, said, I noticed that he seemed to be flashing his money about. However, during the trial, this supposed confession and the supposed evidence that the cops had collected around this guy just fell apart. It became clear during the presentation of prosecution witnesses, this case just didn't make sense. Detective Chief Inspector Dennis Wilson told the jury that Nan initially denied murder when he was remanded into custody after confessing in Manchester. He said, as I was about to leave by the back door of Avingdon Police Station, Nan was on my right about to go into a cell, and Nan shouted after him, "Just a minute." Mr. Wilson said, Nan said, "Look boys, can I have a word with you?" The suspect shrugged off a reminder that his lawyer had told him to write anything down that he wished to say. Keep your mouth shut. But no, he went on to tell him a story completely at odds to his earlier confession. Instead, he said he'd taken a coach from Oxford to Harrow on the Sunday night, the day before the murders, and asked for lodgings in a pub in Harrow, which is a suburb of London. The following morning, he went back up north to collect some wages from a job that he'd done in Solihull. He then said he went off to a different job in Yorkshire, so again, further up north. Asked why he'd confessed to the murders, if in fact he'd been in either London or Solihull or Yorkshire around the time of the murders, and you couldn't possibly have been in Boars Hill if what he's now saying is true. He said, "Oh, well, my mind has been going round and round and round." So they'd not thought to check all this out before the trial. They got the jury in and everything. After 6 days of evidence, the prosecution was stopped by the judge, and the jury was directed to return not guilty verdicts. The judge couldn't stand it anymore. It was clear that this case was absolute nonsense, and that Kenneth Nan had just made stuff up, and the cops were so desperate to have this case solved that they were just prepared to go forward with it. And what on earth were the prosecution thinking? Dear me. Apparently, Nan had also confessed to a murder in Perthshire in Scotland in 1971 that he could never possibly have committed. He was in a completely different part of the country, and he was known for making false statements to the police. So there's insufficient evidence to keep him any longer, so the case just fell apart. But he was happy to go to the press and give a tell-all interview about how he was able to lead the cops into this ridiculous situation that was absolute nonsense. And he said, "I did not know what I was saying when I was interviewed by the police. I am an alcoholic, and when the police picked me up, I had just drunk 2.5 bottles of whiskey." Originally from Dundee, up in Scotland, he was so notorious as being an habitual liar. That's where the name Kenny the Confessor originated. But he became known by everybody who'd heard about this case as Kenny the Confessor. And to this day, Thames Valley Police, who is the force now in charge of this investigation, have confirmed over 50 years later that the case remains unsolved, and it's one of the force's longest running cold cases. No one knows who murdered Warren and Elizabeth Wheeler, an elderly couple who'd never hurt anyone. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it personal? We don't know, but we may never know. So that is the really sad ending to the long lives of Warren and Elizabeth Wheeler. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next episode of Cold Case Christmas. Bye, guys.